Today, Joshua Teplitsky will discuss his book, Prince of the Press, how one collector built history's most enduring and remarkable Jewish history. He will discuss how Rabbi David Oppenheim's archival collection, offers a window into the social life of Jewish books in early modern Europe. And the event will be moderated by Chaim Gottschalk.
Thank you, Amalia. Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon. Chodesh Tov. Thank you all for coming to today's Association of Jewish Libraries Research, Archives, and Special Collections Books About Books series talk. We very much appreciate it. Joshua Teplitsky is an associate professor in the Department of History at Stony Brook University, part of the SUNY system, where he researches and teaches about Jewish life in Central Europe in the early modern period. His book, Prince of the Press, built history's how one collector built history's most enduring and remarkable Jewish library, was published in 2019 by Yale Press, and was awarded the Solobaron Prize of the American Academy for Jewish Research for first book in Jewish studies in 2019. It was also awarded the 2020 Jordan Schnitzer Book Award of the Association for Jewish Studies, and was a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award. He is an associate editor of the forthcoming Encyclopedia of Jewish Book Cultures to be published by Brill. He also co-leads a digital humanities project called Footprints, Jewish Books Through Time and Place, which tracks the movement of Jewish books since the inception of print. He is currently at work on a book reconstructing a plague epidemic in 18th century, not 21st century, but 18th century Prague and its impact on Jewish social and cultural life in the city. I introduce you Dr. Joshua Teplitsky. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Chaim, and all. Thank you for that introduction and for this wonderful invitation. It's so nice to see such a robust attendance on the middle of a Monday from people from an array of different time zones. Just from the one screen that I can see before my eyes, I see people from so many different time zones. It's amazing what Zoom can afford us. And it's such a pleasure to have familiar faces here in front of my eyes, faces that are not familiar, but names that are familiar to me, people whose work I have learned from, silent collaborators, people whom I've emailed to call up books and items and scans. It's such a pleasure to know that there are so many people here, so many of whom we haven't had a chance to meet in person, but what a delight to be here to study and learn together. And the fruits of the research that I'll be showing are in no small part a tribute to the different silent collaborations, little bits and pieces and pointers from so many different people, even from so many that are in this room and in this space today. Just going to ask your indulgence for a moment while I share some slides with you. One of the great benefits of being on Zoom, maybe the only benefit of being on Zoom, is that I can show you some images up close and personal. And so I'll try to share those with you today. Can I just see by a quick thumbs up or thumbs down, is this visible? Thank you, Michelle. Thank you. Great. Okay, great. So it's my pleasure to be here with you today. I can't think of a more suitable and perhaps even more intimidating audience than the Association for Jewish Libraries to share a book about bibliophiles and a book about book lovers. But I'm really delighted to be sharing this material with you today. I'll be giving something of a formal talk. I've prepared remarks, but over a year of Zoom teaching has acclimated me to a robust comment box on the side. And so if people feel like raising questions along the way, I can't guarantee that I'll stop in the middle of a sentence to respond, but people should feel comfortable posing questions along the way, and then we'll collate them at the end and hopefully respond, or at least engage with as many as we possibly can. So with that, without further ado, here are the fruits of some of my research. I'd like to start a bit tongue-in-cheek. In January of 2019, which was precisely when this book came out. In January of 2019, Netflix launched a television program for audiences who liked to watch home improvement shows. The show was called Tidying Up with Marie Kondo. And if there are any who have seen the show, I myself only caught just a preview of it. But I know that the show's primary goal was to help people get rid of all the clutter of clothing and tchotchkes, and only to keep items that spark joy in their lives. The show received particular attention when the titular host, Marie Kondo, whom you see on the screen in front of you, raised serious hackles when rumors began to circulate across the internet that she had suggested that no home should possess more than 30 books. This sparked an internet tempest in a teapot. And I see that this must resonate with some of the people who are in the crowd right now. A tempest in a teapot erupted across social media platforms, especially among bibliophiles of all stripes. I suspect this would resonate with many of the people who are in our crowd today, for whom books are the very epitome of personal joy. What would it mean to take something, hold it in your hands, ask whether or not it sparked joy, and then discard it? What could be more joyous than a book? Now, it turns out the opinions attributed to poor Marie Kondo are actually somewhat overblown. But what I'm more interested in is the reaction to them, which tapped this nerve familiar to book lovers across the ages. And so I thought I would use this as a jumping off point to leap now not hundreds of years prior, but also to leap just one more century backwards in time, to look at a text and an idea which I am certain is familiar to some of our guests here, but is a text that I can read and recite over and over again and never get tired of it. So I'll do that for you as well. When Kondo's words inspired a backlash, she was also tapping into a spirit of bibliophilia that had been articulated nearly a century prior in the immortal words of the sadly mortal Walter Benjamin, a German Jewish thinker. In his short essay, Unpacking My Library. I'm sure this is an essay that people are familiar with, but it's just such a marvelous essay that I'm going to take our attention to this again. Benjamin invites his reader in his essay to encounter, quote, the disorder of crates that have been wrenched open, the air saturated with the dust of wood, the floor covered with torn paper, to join him among piles of volumes, so that you may be ready to share with me a bit of the mood. It's certainly not an elegiac mood, but rather one of anticipation, which these books arouse in a genuine collector. Now, Benjamin's statements are already unfair. There can't be a person in this room who would encounter air saturated with dust, floors covered with torn paper. Assuredly, this is not the world of the librarian or the bibliophile. But Benjamin himself was theorizing the nature of collecting. And in this talk today, my goal will be to describe the personal ambition, professional reputation, and social networks of a single collector as well, one who wished to possess every Jewish book that was produced up to and during his lifetime. His name was David Oppenheim, and over the course of his lifetime that spanned the second half of the 17th century and first third of the 18th century, he collected some 4,500 printed books and another 1,000 manuscripts relating to different aspects of Jewish life and literature. And following Benjamin's lead, although we're looking at a different context in a different time and place, I'd like to take this opportunity to share in the mood which these books arouse in a collector, to invoke sentiments familiar to book lovers, but to embed them in particular contexts, practices, and social and political meanings distinct to a time before our own. My goal in this talk, my goal in this research writ large, was, I think, a simple one, but I hope a meaningful one. I'll begin by sketching the means by which such a collection came into being, and then I'll offer 3 ways in which it was put to use. 1, as a repository for consultation, 2, as a reservoir for new publications, and 3, for my purposes, perhaps most interestingly, as a source of political power. Again, so my goal will be first to explore how this collection came to be, but I'm most interested in the uses to which it was put in its particular historical context. That's first of all, as a repository for consultation, as a research resource. Second, as a reservoir for new publications to be produced. And third, as a source of political power. Now, Oppenheim's collection was built not coincidentally at a moment in which the new science of bibliography was beginning to take hold across the European continent. As perhaps a provocative statement, I'm going to put before your eyes here an early manual on establishing a library, a 1627 manual produced in France for establishing a library. I'm quite certain that David Oppenheim never encountered this manual, nor conversed with the theorists of library creation or organization of the 17th century. But I offer this instead to point to the way that he was participating in the spirit of an age. Participating in the spirit of an age. The 17th century saw the rise of knowledge collecting in the service of political power, and I'm conscious of the fact that there are medievalists among us who will assuredly refine some of what I'm saying here, but I'm going to still stand by the claim that the 17th century saw an acceleration, certainly one of trends that was centuries in the making, but an acceleration of trends of the construction of libraries in the service of political power, an acceleration and a rapid diffusion of this. French kings and German nobles, as well as amateur Italian scientists, English gentlemen, the list goes on, produced collections of artifacts and books that were born both out of personal curiosity, but also as tools and symbols of political power. I think that the manual that is up on the screen here, produced by Gabriel Naudé, called Advice on Establishing a Library, is a lovely example of the way that the 17th century experienced or witnessed a certain novelty, both accelerating trends that reached back through the Middle Ages, if not before, but also saw new modes of organization, thought, and dedication to the function, purpose, and use of libraries. To the extent that Oppenheim absorbed this, it's because of his participation in an elite network of Jews. Oppenheim had the good fortune to be born into the families of the court Jews of Germany. The court Jews of Germany emerged, or of the German lands, I should say, emerged in the years after the closing of the 30 Years' War, a conflict which had upended alliances and destroyed economies. And when the fighting subsided, emperors, electors, princes, and bishops undertook to rebuild and refashion their regimes in the absence of pre-war creditors and fearing competition from other nobles. And in so searching to rebuild their regimes, they turned to outsiders, Jews, who were prepared to take economic risk in exchange for opportunity. These risk takers belonged to the wealthiest stratum of German Jewry. Beneath them were numerous multitudes of paupers and middle-class merchants. They were only just members of the thinnest stratum of Jewish elite in Central Europe, but they came in time to be known as the court Jews on account of the services they rendered to German noble retinues. And the subject of our story today, David Oppenheim, as I say, had the good fortune to be born into the most prestigious of these families, which included Samuel Oppenheimer, the court Jew to the emperor in Vienna, as well as financiers of lower rank but still great significance to commercial life in Heidelberg, Frankfurt am Main, and Worms, as well as others. The fact that we have portraits of the court Jews already tells us something about their straddling of multiple worlds. And as you may notice in the images that you see in front of you, the court Jews in these images are portrayed as people with paper. Court Jews are portrayed as people with paper. They're holding documents. There are quills in their hands. The portrayal, the artistic renditions of these men are people who understand administration, finance, record keeping, the worlds made by paper. I contend that it's both this wealth and status, as well as this world made by paper, that offered David Oppenheim every educational opportunity, and that was decisive in shaping his approach to books, politics, and the nexus between the two. Oppenheim began his studies around the age of 4 at home in Worms in the Western Holy Roman Empire with a tutor by the name of Yair Chaim Bachrach, an important man in the world of Jewish studies, Jewish knowledge, rabbinic learning, and an awareness of paper knowledge, editing, and publishing as well. And in the years that followed, Oppenheim began to travel away from home, as was quite a common practice for elite young men of a certain standing, akin to the grand tours undertaken by non-Jewish contemporaries of his era. Oppenheim traveled and studied under rabbinic masters in the Western Holy Roman Empire and across the border into France, in Metz, Friedberg, Landsberg. It had to have been in these years that Oppenheim began to build his collection, and at first this collection must have taken a shape no different than that of other students. In fact, the earliest artifact of his collecting that I've been able to identify, and perhaps somebody will find still an earlier one, but the earliest artifact that I have been able to identify was a notebook, a copybook, something quite common for early modern students who would copy sections of books as part of their study. The item in question here, the one that you see on the screen before you, is a 1675 notebook that is a Sefer Evronot, a book of calendrical intercalation. It was produced by the young man, or rather the notebook itself was gifted to him at about the age of 11, and then he used it to do this mathematical calculation of the calendar, which was quite a common domain of study for young men in the early modern period. But I'm going to use this book for a different reason. Because this was a blank notebook that was given to the young man, after he was finished with it as a Sefer Evronot, he used the blank pages for another purpose. And I think for our purpose, this is an exciting one. He used the blank pages to build his first inventory of his library. Although the book was gifted to him in 1675, the inventory appears to have been constructed in the year 1682, with his marriage at the age of 17 to Genendel, the daughter of Lefman Berns, who was the court Jew of Hanover. And this event appears to have occasioned a cascade of books into his library and marks an early stage in the young man's itemization of his collection. In fact, this is in one of the few documents, in one of the few ego documents in which he tells us a bit about his intention. The attendees may notice I'm actually going to tell you very, very little about the man's intentions. I'll tell you more about the outcomes rather than the intentions of this library. And that's because the man himself wrote very, very few manifestos telling us exactly what his purposes were. We rather have to reconstruct what the outcomes and effects were rather than what his intentions and goals were. But what you see on the screen before you is one delightful exception to the rule. Around the time of this collection, whether it was between 1682 to 1685, Oppenheim wrote a little ditty, a little poem to introduce his catalog. And with some poetic license, I've translated into English as follows. With good fortune, the books I have bought with my wealth, to honor my God who formed and acquired me, I've organized them by letter in order, each letter in its vessel and quarter, so that the finder may find with facility at hand any book which is missing from the land. And may God grant me to collect and accrue them, that God's Torah in Israel may spread far and wide, to make books to no end, and to sustain us and speedily bring the end of days. Amen, amen, amen. Now, Oppenheim was getting a little playful, at least in one small part with his writings here. He invoked the phrase to make books to no end, a verse from Ecclesiastes, Kohelet 12:12, in which the author of the text warns the reader against the folly of the overproduction of books, saying, "And furthermore, my son, be admonished of making many books, there is no end. Much study is a weariness of the flesh." But Oppenheim's youthful prose and the energy of this young collector inverted that desperation, be admonished of making books there is no end, its weariness of the flesh, into aspiration, took it instead as a challenge, as instruction for a program of acquisition in action. In producing an inventory of his own possessions, Oppenheim twice listed his materials, sensitive both to the contents of the library as intellectual objects, but also as social objects. His catalog first organized all of the titles in alphabetical order. He dedicated a blank side of a page to each letter of the Hebrew alphabet, Aleph, Bet, Gimel, as follows, leaving them blank so that he could fill them in over time. And if I move my head out of the way, you can even notice, look, there's some scratched out components to it. The ink is darker and lighter in different places. This was a living document to which he added items over time as he acquired more books, and which he consulted as he traveled to figure out whether or not he already owned a copy of a book which he may yet wish to acquire. But the catalog also reveals the social life of books. And here, after he had itemized each of the books alphabetically, or after he had his alphabetical pages, he then listed all of the items again according to their provenance, according to the sources from whom he had purchased this book or received this book, often listing the occasion, the location, the name of the person from whom he received it, as well as, wherever possible, the prices. And if you see along the left side of this page, you can see a kind of ledger. There are prices there as well. It reads as a kind of roadmap of I would say, the second-hand book industry for Jews in the 17th and 18th centuries. Just to give you a sense, now, these operate in kind of concentric circles. The first entries in this notebook recorded gifts and purchases that reflect primarily local availability, as well as likely cultural identification with his local site in the Western Holy Roman Empire in Worms. Thus, for example, in 1686, he spent 2.2 Reichsthalers on a purchase of 10 volumes from a vendor in Worms. I don't know how many times I can say vendor in Worms 5 times fast, but I'll try my best to do it. And those included items that were printed in Riva di Trento, in Mantua, in Venice, and Prague. 2 weeks before Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, again in 1686, he purchased about 100 items from a scribe in Worms, who doubled as a bookseller. And this is, I think, quite an interesting point. This scribe, whose business it was to reproduce books, was also a bookman. In the absence of bookstores, he was the kind of person who procured not just manuscripts, but printed texts as well. And this is probably a good moment for me to point out that in this 1680s catalog, Oppenheim does not make a structural organizational distinction between books and manuscripts. He does note next to the ones that are manuscripts, ktav yad, that they are manuscripts, but he doesn't categorically distinguish between them when he talks about their production, which tells us something about different stages, eras, and systems of book and knowledge organization. Oppenheim also reveals to us his contact with individual authors. In the absence of bookstores, individual authors themselves might double as vendors of their literary products, taking to the roads to peddle the books they had written and published. Perhaps that's what I'm doing right now. I've got a copy of the book in hand with me, and it's available at your local bookstore or on Amazon Prime. But official vendors were, of course, not the only way that Oppenheim acquired books. I'm most interested in this collection, in particular for what it tells us about the second-hand economy of books. Gabriel Naudé himself had advised his French readers, or rather his French patron, his particular noble patron, that the very best means of acquiring a book was to gobble up some other entire and undissipated library. And this was certainly a practice that Oppenheim undertook as well, perhaps simply intuiting it. What to me is so interesting about this as well is that this process, at least in Oppenheim's practices, had a gendered dynamic to it. Oppenheim often purchased books in their entirety from widows whose husbands were deceased and who understood books not only as objects of study, but items that had significant capital to them. On the 6th of April, 1688, for example, Oppenheim gained 37 volumes for his collection by purchasing them from a widow of one Joseph Halevi. In September of 1691, he bought some 19 more from the widow of Avram Stern of Worms for a sum of 20 Reichstaler and 12.5 Batzen. Oppenheim's collection is really interesting, at least for my purposes, in that he allows us also to get away from a strictly elite story of a wealthy man and to peer into the smaller collecting practices of Jews of his era, whether it's to determine what the widow of Avram Stern of Worms had in her possession, or sometimes in other cases we can open up a volume in the collection and find in the flyleaves a micro catalog, a micro inventory by previous owners. Here are 3 different examples on the screen in front of you. 2 out of the 3 of them are from manuscript items. 1 of them is from the flyleaf of a printed work. And in each of the cases, the previous owners, these are not Oppenheim, the previous owners have listed the modest number of books in their collection. The one I've foregrounded in the center of the screen has just 3. And the Hebrew inscription at the top reads, B'siyata dishmaya Rishimat Hasfarim Shali, with the help of God, the list of my books. So quite an intentional listing of books, and there are 3. Full stop. The others have in the teens to approximately 30 in them. What's so wonderful about this man's preserving activities is he affords us he opens a vista into worlds of Jews relating to books that extend far, far beyond the super wealthy into all kinds of smaller, more modest, dare I say, more ordinary domains of Jewish experience as well. In the years that followed, Oppenheim would travel far and wide. All of the examples that I've given thus far have been from locals, people who have come to Oppenheim. But in the years that followed, he would also expand his network and acquire books from ever wider circles. Already in 1687, he dispatched a tutor from Worms to the Frankfurt Fair, to nearby Frankfurt, an important book market. And later, when the book trade center of gravity shifted from Frankfurt to Leipzig in eastern Germany, Oppenheim would occasionally travel there in person. He would leave his rabbinic post, which we'll come to in a moment, to jostle among the hundreds of sellers and thousands of buyers, Jewish and non-Jewish, who participated in this annual fair. Another means of acquiring books, and soon we'll move past the acquisition of books into the uses to which the books were put, but another means of acquiring books was through hiring copyists to produce books on demand for him. One of the most important agents in this process for Oppenheim was a scribe by the name of Azriel of Krotoshin, who was trained in a school in northern Italy under the leadership of Moses Zacuto and Benjamin Cohen. This was a scriptorium of sorts that was a crucial agent in the dissemination of Kabbalah. And we have some important scholars of Kabbalah who have joined us today, and I'll defer to them for more detail on this. I want to point instead to just this one agent in Oppenheim's world, Azriel of Krotoshin, who was especially important for reproducing texts for Oppenheim. But what I'm interested in is the way that he would transcribe works that were produced in a Sephardic and Mediterranean hand to an Ashkenazic or Central European hand. Over the centuries, as many of you I'm sure know, Jews had developed different styles of standardized handwriting. And Oppenheim had a special preference for the hand of his native lands of Central Europe. In fact, he would often receive letters from agents elsewhere who would say, I have identified a manuscript for you, but it's going to take a bit more time to get it to you because we are having it copied from the Sephardic or occasionally Italian hand into the Ashkenazic hand, which we know you prefer. There was an Ashkenazization of these texts, these Jewish texts that had certain universal Jewish pretensions, that were Ashkenazicized as they were incorporated into Oppenheim's library. Now, in the image in front of you, he actually has both. He's got the Sephardic and the Ashkenazic hand, but what's so interesting is that he undertook a process to make sure that they were accessible, visible in the Ashkenazic hand, so that they could be used first and foremost by Oppenheim, but also by his contemporaries. And we'll pivot now to talking about some of the uses of the library. The library became increasingly important as Oppenheim matured from an aspiring student to a scholar of independent standing. By 1691, he had received a prestigious post at the helm of the Jewish community of Nikolsburg, as well as the entire regional association of the Jews of Moravia, which is in the eastern portion of today's Czech Republic. Just over a decade later, in 1703, he was awarded the chief rabbinate of Prague, which was at the time the largest urban community of Jews in all of Christian Europe. These new roles entailed administration of Jewish educational institutions, presiding over courts, and playing an active role in drafting, certifying, and interpreting legislation which was outside of the realm of just halacha. It's difficult to translate halacha. Let's call it, perhaps for our purposes, rabbinic law. But Jews, of course, in the early modern period had a much more expansive system of law and governance that was beyond just halacha alone, but rather was embraced the whole world of statutory law produced by communal consensus and through the coercive power of imperial fiat. And so Oppenheim lived in these multiple worlds, and his library served these multiple purposes. On the one hand, his library was of crucial importance for producing the lectures that he offered to his students in his yeshiva, for producing the sermons that he offered twice yearly, maximally, in the communities in which he lived. But also, these texts were important as Oppenheim served as a kind of jurisconsult, a high court of appeals for Jews who were debating and disputing the tax codes of their periods. In fact, maybe I'll show you, Oppenheim at times was understood as being so deeply important to the world of the appellate system, but also as himself a collector, preserver, and I might even say archivist, that in the year 1697, the Jews of Moravia made him the keeper of their statutes, the personal keeper of their statutes. Prior to this time, the statutes were kept in a particular location, not kept with a particular person. They were almost more institutional and less personal. But in the year 1697, the Jews of Moravia conducted a kind of about face, something that is really, I think, a bit of a blip in a trend towards depersonalization and institutionalization. And instead, the Jews of Moravia argued that for the first time in their history, they were going to entrust the keeping of these documents in Oppenheim's hands himself. I presume this as an indication of his reputation, a reputation he took an active role in shaping as a caretaker of books and texts. It wasn't just the preservation, though. Oppenheim also played an active role in drafting and producing and creating statutes. In 1706, this doesn't correspond to this image, but it's the closest that I have for us for today. In 1706, the Jewish communal elders of Hildesheim took upon themselves the task of rewriting their Jewish civil statutes. And they appealed to Oppenheim to help in this task. And in response to their request, Oppenheim drafted 21 statutes by which the community should administer itself, ranging from methods for selecting its leaders to the confirmation of an ancient custom that, quote, the community will have a special box with 2 keys, and within it they shall place all of the ledgers and contracts and all of the items that relate to the kahal. Yet again, an opportunity to think about archival practices, storage practices, the worlds of paper knowledge in early modern Europe. And it's also worth pointing out that Oppenheim was not in any way formally an authority over the Jews of Hildesheim. Rather, it was his reputation as a well-trained rabbi, but also a man who knew books, a man who knew paper knowledge, a man who had access to more texts than his contemporaries, was the one to approach to shape politics and administration on account of all of this. But that, of course, was not the only use of the library. The library was absolutely a wellspring of information for rabbinic contemporaries. Rabbinic writings from the period feature lots of scattered asides in which authors credit Oppenheim's library as the source of a rare text. Here are on the screen, here are letters Oppenheim received. We are quite fortunate that to this day, much of Oppenheim's correspondence, or at least rather one side of Oppenheim's correspondence, the incoming letters, are preserved to this day. They're in the Bodleian Library, where the entire collection stands as well. We'll get to that in a moment. But there we can see letters that he received from people indicating requests to view items from the library. And then when we turn to print matter produced during this man's lifetime, we can find all kinds of texts in which Oppenheim's library is credited. His relative Yaakov Risher, a member of the Jewish court of Prague, and an author of 3 volumes of Responsa, writes, here's just a simple quote: "I found and saw in the Responsa of the Rashba, the medieval commentator, in manuscript in the noble collection of my in-law, the great David Oppenheim." In 1709, Oppenheim received a request from a man in Halberstadt who was writing his own commentary on a portion of the Talmud, and he asked to come visit Oppenheim's library to consult manuscript editions of the Talmud in the hopes of discovering textual variants. So the library would then serve as a source for textual criticism, for careful textual criticism. So let's see, we've got medieval commentary, we've got Talmud. The author of a book of customs, for example, came to view a manuscript in the Oppenheim collection, which he indicated is, quote, "still not printed, but can be found in the bibliothèque of the famed sage." And this is one of the few times the library is referred to as a bibliothèque. It's usually referred to as an otsar, as a treasury. But here we can also see the migration of the term across different cultures, the bibliothèque of the famed sage. A copyist and editor of Kabbalistic manuscripts visited the library shortly after Oppenheim's death in 1737 and commented once again on his use of a manuscript that had come from Tzfat Safed and had sections that were not available in the other manuscript editions, which he found in the Oppenheim library. It's worth saying, though, that despite the access he granted to others, Oppenheim always preserved for himself a privileged position. When he wrote his own halachic rulings, he would often refer to items that he found in his library, subtly indicating that others didn't have access to this material, and thereby offering him a kind of intellectual, cultural, and authoritative superiority over others. Let me see if I can, here's just an image that I like that was done for Oppenheim. Here is, here's just an image produced during the time, the title page of a work with Oppenheim sitting at his desk, studying and reading a book before him. And it reads, "Vayeshev David al kiseh malchuto," and David sat upon his royal throne. This royalty was more than just playfulness or the attribution of a verse, and it's an imprecise verse at that. Rather, Oppenheim himself did hold a royal title, although the elements of it are a little bit sketchy. In the year 1697, Oppenheim was invited to take up a rabbinic position in Jerusalem. He was offered the position by emissaries from the Ashkenazic Jewish community of Jerusalem, who had long maintained contact with the man, sending him books in exchange for his philanthropic activities. Being related to the wealthiest Jews of Central Europe, Oppenheim was an important philanthropic agent. And although he declined the invitation to become chief rabbi of Jerusalem, he accepted the title, and for the next 20 years or so continued to refer to himself as the Nasi Eretz Yisrael, Prince of the Land of Israel. This was a title that Oppenheim did not invent. Others during the 17th and 18th century used it, it primarily had an honorific function for charity collectors, but it conferred upon Oppenheim ever greater standing and status. And in many publications of the period, in letters that are addressed to him, he is referred to with this royal moniker. I use this as an example also to show you part of the work that Oppenheim did with this. For rather than simply accepting the royal moniker, he also used the power of the printing press to express it. The object that you see before you is a broadside. It's a broadside publication of Oppenheim's letter declining the invitation to become chief rabbi. And to publish a decline is, I think, a really interesting move. If Oppenheim had become chief rabbi, then everybody would know that he was chief rabbi of Jerusalem because he would be in Jerusalem. But because he wasn't actually taking up the post, what he did instead was compensate for the absence with a print stand-in, and ran off many, many, many copies. I don't know how widely disseminated they were. There are many, many copies of these broadsides pasted into the folio editions of Oppenheim's books in the Bodleian Library today. So I genuinely don't know, did these travel far and wide, or did he run them off and was he the only one who had a stack of them at home? I fear I don't quite know the answer to that. There are some that moved beyond his collection, but I think it still nonetheless points to his savvy with media, his dissemination of news and information through a broadside object like this. And while we're on the topic of broadsides, one of the gifts of the Oppenheim collection is the way that it preserves ephemeral material of this nature. For when I was working through barely reading the content of the folio books that Oppenheim had, but instead thumbing through all of the folio Talmuds that he has, in addition to finding many of these letters to the Ashkenazic Jewish community of Jerusalem, we can find all kinds of other ephemeral broadsides pasted into the largest books in his collection. Some of these were intended for home decor. Some of them are maps that were produced during the period of the Holy Land. Some of them, like this one that I'm still trying to puzzle out, which has a Kabbalistic appearance to it, is actually a grammar chart intended for teaching young men Hebrew grammar. So it's much less exciting than it looks, but also much more exciting than it looks, depending on the nature of the questions that we wish to ask. And so I think what marks the Oppenheim's collection is so fascinating is the way that it incorporates ephemeral material, and that reaches beyond the big and into the small as well. It incorporates within it popular reading material. It incorporates within it Yiddish prayers for women. This is an example that I've been working on quite a bit. This is a new tchina, or prayer, for people who perished in the plague that was produced in Prague in 1718-19. And is part of what pointed me towards my current project about reconstructing a plague epidemic in Prague in the early 18th century. Some other texts were directed closely to young men, such as the work Yud Shir Stam, which retold the biblical tale of the binding of Isaac. And between these two poles of exorbitantly expensive and negligibly cheap were an array of medium-sized volumes, prayer books, Bibles. Oppenheim owns 63 copies of the Passover Haggadah in 45 different editions, for example. So his work really offers us a world of different opportunity to reach into aspects and elements of Jewish culture in a time before our own. Now, I do want to leave some time for us to get to questions or even discussion. They don't need to be questions. People can just share observations of their own. So perhaps I'll just note very briefly that although Oppenheim was chief rabbi of Prague, his books were not with him for most of the time there. Prague had a very strict censorial regime under the hand-in-glove relationship between the re-Catholicizing Habsburg monarchy of the late 17th century and the Jesuit authorities in the city. And this really did have a very strict censorial regime. Jews were not the first targets of this regime. Rather, the very Catholic city was concerned about Protestant heresies much more than it was about Jewish heresies. But as part of the wider purview of censorial oversight, Jewish books were watched as well. And fearing this regime, Oppenheim secured in his father-in-law's estate in Hanover a home to store his books. And it was actually there that the library took on a kind of life of its own. Without the owner, it needed a professional librarian. It needed a system. It couldn't just be the child of the idiosyncrasies of the owner. It needed to be manageable. Many of us have our own private libraries that have a certain randomness to it, but when we are the keepers of something that needs to be intelligible to a wider world, that's a different story. I know this is being recorded, and so I say this trepidatiously, but even in my parents' home, for example, my mother will sometimes say to my father, looking at his desk, "Your desk is a mess." And he says, "My desk isn't a mess. I know exactly where everything is." And only when he begins to clean things up does he lose everything. So we each idiosyncratically have our own systems of order. But of course, once it is parted, once we part with our system, it needs to take on a greater intelligibility. And once that happened in Hanover, the library received a kind of independent existence. And it was there that visitors, both Jewish and Christian alike, and since most of my examples have been Jewish, I specifically want to draw our attention to a visitor named Johann Andersen, who was a Christian diplomat who paid a visit to the library in the winter of 1713 and remarked at just how very noteworthy the entire collection was. Visitors by Christians begot other visitors by Christians. In fact, the library was visited by the great bibliographer of the era, Johann Christoph Wolff, who used the library to produce his own, not catalogs, but rather bibliographies of the era to tell his readers what kind of important Jewish books were out there. And this is, I think, a valuable point for us as well, that sometimes we use bibliographies to build real collections, and we can also use real collections to expand bibliographies. The library thus existed in Hanover, where it was visited by Christians and Jews alike. They continued to use it in a variety of ways. But when Oppenheim died in 1736, it left the library as somewhat orphaned. You can see in front of you all the things that I'm skipping, which means we've got food for discussion if we wish to come to it soon. I'll try to use the next 2.5 minutes just to tell you a bit about the afterlife of the library, and then the floor is open. Oppenheim died in the year 1736, having lived a relatively long life of 72 years. May we know even more in health and wellness. The library then passed to his daughter, first to his son, who survived him only by 3 more years, and then to Oppenheim's granddaughter, Genendel, named for Oppenheim's first wife. But by this time, the family's fortunes had significantly waned, which was not unusual for the culture of court Jews. In early modern Europe, they usually rose swiftly and fell within the span of about 3 generations. And so Genendel commissioned an appraisal of the library in order to use it as collateral against her significant loans. She solicited the opinion of leading experts of Judaica. One, Johann David Michaelis, a professor of Oriental Studies in Göttingen, and also Moses Mendelssohn, the father of Jewish Enlightenment. Mendelssohn had suggested that the library is worth some 50 to 60,000 Reichstaler. That would certainly not be too expensive to pay. But before a buyer could be found, a relative of Genendel appears to have remitted her outstanding debts in exchange for the collection. And so the library then moved from Hanover to the North German port city of Hamburg. The movement of the library coincided with significant shifts in Jewish political life. This took place in the 1780s, an era of the first offerings of emancipation, and soon with the significant winds of revolutionary war blowing first out from Paris and Versailles, until ultimately they encompassed the continent and significant parts of the world for nearly a quarter of a century, relegating the library to back burner. Well, only somewhat. Actually, when a republic was established in Westphalia by Napoleon's armies, and the emperor installed his brother Jerome as ruler, a consistory was established to handle Jewish affairs, and the president of that consistory was lobbied to purchase the library as a vehicle to regenerate Jewish culture in a new, modern key of citizenship. Yet efforts like this actually came to naught. And instead, the library was repeatedly prepared for auction. In 1826, an auction catalog, the one that you can see just over my shoulder here, I don't know how to point my finger in the right direction. The one you can see, it's a mirrored screen. The one that you can see just over my shoulder here was produced in 1826 in anticipation of an auction that was attempting to sell off the collection in its totality, but was also prepared to sell it off piecemeal. In late 1826, the Bodleian Library dispatched an agent to Hamburg who visited the collection and placed a bid. Although the auction was scheduled to take place in 1827, the auction itself was postponed with this very attractive bid. And in 1828, in May of 1828, the parties settled on a final sum of just over 2,000 pounds, which was approximately 9,000 Reichstaler, which was a far cry from Mendelssohn's projected 50 or 60,000. And a full year later, in May of 1829, the library's contents were packed into 34 crates, and they arrived in Oxford that summer, where they have been ever since. Over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries, some lamented the fact that the collection was on a remote island in England rather than in Central Europe, where the lion's share of world Jewry lived and could benefit from this collection. But the strange twists of fate also resulted in its preservation, from the fact that that Oxford was not bombed during the war, and to this day, the collection still stands, where anyone with a reader's card, and I guess at this point anyone with a vaccine card, can visit it. I'm particularly homesick for this collection that I used to visit at least once a year, if not more. But a time will come when we'll be able to see it again. And so perhaps in conclusion, maybe I'll return to Benjamin once more. I opened this talk with Benjamin, I'll close it. Benjamin wrote, "To renew the old world, that is the collector's deepest desire." And if we pace through the stacks of this collection, or we thumb carefully through the folios of the books, a world of encounters open up before the eyes of the beholder. For some scholars, these books avail themselves to the reconstruction of a single school of thought or intellectual phenomenon, but they also take us into the individual fates of copies of books and the wider social, intellectual, and professional ties they reflect. In the aggregate, we can see both the trees and the forest towards an understanding of intellectual trends, but also a man who animated a collection in the service of politics and scholarship, as well as the wider backdrop of women and men, of Jews and Christians, of artists and scribes, of rich and poor, of local and global, that converged in the making of this magnificent, enduring library. And with that, I thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Joshua. This is a phenomenal presentation you did. Wow, very best. I'd like to open up the floor for questions. You can put the questions in the chat, or if you want, you could raise hands. And I'll try to get to as many as I can. We have about, at this point, it's 1:23, so about 7 minutes. I know, Josh, you have to head off soon, so we'll try to do this. And so let's see. If anybody has any questions, we'll start, or I have a question to start off. Okay. So, Josh, I mean, you mentioned briefly that he had a working catalog that he carried with him. Can you talk a little bit about that? How he didn't have control of his library at home because he was away, but how did his catalog, his personal catalog, if you will, this pocketbook of a catalog, function for him, or what role did it play for him? If you can mention a little bit about that.
It's a fabulous question. I'm so glad you asked it. It gives me the opportunity to tell more stories. So thank you for that. Now, there are multiple answers to the question. The first is that, as you've astutely pointed out, the man lived remotely from his collection. I'm sure many of us who spent time remotely from our collections know exactly those trials. But I'm not convinced he was truly that remote from his collection. Oppenheim divided his time between his rabbinical position in Prague and with his library in Hanover. And I am still not fully certain how much time he spent in each place. Why am I so uncertain of this? In some of the correspondence that is preserved directed to Oppenheim, the letters are addressed not to Prague, but rather to Hanover, which means that his contemporaries were aware of the fact that if they needed to find him in a pinch, Prague may not be the best place to look for him first. He had a not just a mail forwarding service, but people would address their questions to the site of his library, not to the location of his chief rabbinate, which I think tells us that he either divided his time, or we know he divided his time, but it raises questions about how much time he actually spent in the place where he was meant to be chief rabbi. But I think your second question about the catalog itself is such a delightful one. The 1713 Christian visitor to the collection noted that Oppenheim kept a copy of his catalog with him. And I think it served as a kind of surrogate for the library. When he was away, he would be able to consult the catalog and say, well, this is what I have. Sometimes that served very practical functions. When he was considering purchasing new items, he could thumb through the catalog and say, no, I actually have 3 copies of this already. I don't truly need another. But I suspect, and this is just my conjecture, but I suspect that it did serve a kind of emotional soothing function for him. I do suspect that it served as a kind of security. And the reason that I say this, I conjecture but boldly, is because Oppenheim would often write about himself in emotional terms. He would talk about himself as a man whose greatest joy or pleasure was with books. The phrase was ish kamoni nachat yenachet bisfarim. I am somebody who derives great joy or pleasure. The Yiddish would be naches. He gets great naches from books. So he himself used an emotional vocabulary to talk about his relationship to these books. They weren't just bare intellectual objects. They were objects from which he derived joy, pleasure, and naches. And so I suspect that the catalog served a kind of soothing function like that for
like
him
a security
as
blanket.
well.
We have a question from Stephanie. How much of the collection has been digitized and accessible, and any theses or dissertations?
But thank you for that question. Thank you for that question. On the one hand, to my sadness, and on the other hand, to something of my joy, actually very, very little of the collection has been digitized. Only a select small number of the manuscripts and only of the most visually appealing manuscripts have been digitized through the wonderful collaboration between the Bodleian Library and the Polonsky Foundation. I'll see if I can scare up a link to be shared with people. Part of the challenge of the Oppenheim Library is it is so vast. It is so vast that to digitize it would take tremendous, tremendous resources. And as we all know, our resources are scarce. Why do I say that I don't see it as an unmitigated evil that the materials are not digitized? Because I think we all know that there is still no comparison. Thanks, Michelle. Thank you for that. There is no comparison for handling. Nothing compares to handling a book in all of its materiality. And so there's something quite nice about the fact that an investigation of the books demands material engagement with its total sensory experience, and that the digital has not obviated or made obsolete the sensory experience of handling these books and discovering the flyleaf. I see a question here from Barry Wallfish. Hi, who asks, did he collect all his life or did he stop at some point? Could the catalog have served him as a purchasing tool to avoid duplication? Lovely. He appears to really have continued collecting and to have delegated the collecting authority to his son, who served as the library's caretaker. When Oppenheim parted ways with the library in 1703, his son was installed as the librarian in situ in Hanover, and books continued to flow into the library after that point. In fact, there are even a couple, very, very few, but there are a couple of posthumous acquisitions in the library as well. And while indeed the catalog could have served as a purchasing tool to avoid duplication, this was a man who didn't really fear duplication. There are many, many duplicates in the library, and there could have been many, many more, but this is a man who didn't fear duplications in his collection. There are duplicate copies of lots of the works there as well.
We have probably go take one more question after you're done with this one for Barry. So just to give you just a heads up, that's one from Rachel. She's interested in the research process. How did you decide to focus on the library and knowledge building through a physical collection? So once you're done with Barry's questions, that's this one, and then.
Sure. So I think I'll state that as the end of my answer to Barry. Although, Barry, if you want to follow up, I'd be delighted to continue discussing and hypothesizing and theorizing this with you and the rest of the members of this group. Rachel, thank you for this question. You know, it wasn't my plan. I'll be perfectly candid. It wasn't my plan. When I first met Oppenheim, I met him in the margins, in the indexes, in the side remarks of the stories of other early modern figures. I knew I was interested in the city of Prague. Anyone who's been knows it's a remarkable city, and so much material. I mean that quite literally. That the city is the objects of the city are so well preserved, and the archival holdings are so rich there. And there is a magic allure to the city of Prague that is just a draw for the historian as well. I thought that I was going to be telling a story about Oppenheim as political actor. And I hope that isn't absent from the story. I had to do it only in brief in our discussions here, but in the book, I try to treat him really as a political agent. But you can't tell a story about this man without talking about his library. And his books drew me in. The sources pulled me in the direction. I didn't know what direction this project would go. I tried to keep an open mind, and the sources pulled me into exploring a story that was about books in their social, political, and cultural milieu. The fact that the library is still extant allowed for a physical collection to go this way. And it's perhaps because of the marginalia, the owner's inscriptions, and the wonderful letters or epistolary correspondence that Oppenheim preserved that allow a kind of triangulation of these different sources to look at the materiality of these books as they exist, the interventions in handwriting into these worlds of parallel sources, whether they're the letters to Oppenheim, the print material in which he makes his impact, administrative documents that come, German language administrative documents from the Habsburg regime. When put all together, they, I think, demand a contextualized reading of this thing to understand it in its wider contexts. And it was that I think allowed me to tell a story of this man that went beyond the books alone into questions about knowledge building and the politics of knowledge building. In fact, I even think that they allowed, or they suggested, at least to me, different ways of thinking about Jewish politics. They took me away from the prescribed texts of Jewish communal regulations and also showed me the informal workings of favoritism, of rumor, of schmoozing, of nepotism, quite frankly. The German word for nepotism is Vetternwirtschaft, which translates just like nepotism itself to uncle economics, to the power of familial ties and informality to allow us to think not just about how political systems are intended to work, but also to show us how they worked through the informality of politics. So those were some of the concerns that I brought with these as I was trying to write this book. Hopefully in the years to come, somebody will write another book and prove me completely wrong, or at least take the conversation in a new direction, and I'll be delighted with the growing world of scholarship in that way as well. It will be nice to someday be an obsolete author as well.
Joshua, thank you so much for everything, for your wonderful, wonderful presentation, and for your time today too. And we at AJL, and I, on behalf of AJL, I really, we thank you very much.
It's a genuine pleasure. This truly, I can't think of a more fitting group with which to share this. It's a genuine pleasure and a true honor to be invited. Truly, my thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joshua. Thanks everyone for coming, and we appreciate everyone being here to listen to the talk. And let me remind for 2 upcoming events on April 21 and April 28. Thank you.
Thank you, Amalia.
Joshua, if you have, he left. I wanted to ask a question. Okay. I just, if you have 1 minute, I would like to ask you a question. I was fascinated by what you mentioned about that he had things transcribed from the Sephardic script to the Ashkenazi script. And I wanted to ask if he would also keep the original Sephardic item, or he would just receive the transcribed item.
Both. In many cases, he had both copies of them. It's really lovely that we can compare them side by side as well. It's fascinating. It's fascinating. It wasn't really until I saw others writing letters to him where they described the process. So we've got the material evidence, and I'm certainly not the one that discovered the material evidence. They're already in the wonderful 3-volume work by Yossi Avivi called Kabbalah Ta'ari. There's a discussion of this figure. I was so fascinated that when I actually got to see direct letters to Oppenheim reflecting on his preference for Ashkenazic script rather than Sephardic script, and the amount of time it would take to copy from one to another, that leads us into really understanding the intentionality of this process. It wasn't just happenstance, but direct, intentional, and commissioned.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
So I'm sorry to run. I do have to run to a meeting, but people are very welcome to be in touch.